Hello, I'm Robyn Rocket, and welcome to my podcast. This is a podcast series of edited interviews from my radio series on Resonance FM in 2023. You can still listen to the radio shows at robynrocket.com/zoom. Robyn is spelled Rabyn. This is part 1 of 2 of an interview with record producer Kristian Craig Robinson, aka Capitol K. Hey, thanks so much for chatting to me, Kay. I guess my first question is, where does your name come from? For people who've not heard it or seen it, I'm going to spell it. It's Capitol, then a space, and then K, like K for Kit Kat.
A friend of mine was digging up loads of amazing electronic music, and they kept sending me mixtapes. At the time I was making just sort of like guitar music and experimenting with 4 tracks. I thought, I'll make some music. I'll make some electronic music like the stuff that they're sending me. And so I was just jamming out with these tape loops and 4 tracks. And then I was just improvising lyrics, and I started singing, I'm talking about Capital K, Capital K. And I think it was like an expression of ego at the time.
Why is it spelt with an O in the word capital?
That's a misspelling because I'm quite dyslexic, but then it's quite good in a way because it actually made it search engine unique.
Were your family into music? Was there a lot of music when you were growing up?
Not really. My dad was in a skiffle band. There was a handful of reel-to-reel tapes in our house of him playing acoustic guitar with someone on a washboard. Every Saturday we'd go to the supermarket. We were living in Asia at the time, and it was all bootleg music, so everything was just pirated cassette tapes. So we had a thing of every weekend we'd go to the supermarket and we would always buy a cassette tape. And then the cassette tapes were like what we listened to in car journeys. My first obsessions were ABBA and Blondie. My mum and dad would always buy Barry White or Crystal Gale.
Were you born in Asia, and how long did you live there?
I was there from like 2.5, 3 till 10. In a country called Brunei in North Borneo.
Did you have an interest in music when you were at school?
I was really into art and making things, So I was doing a lot of like jewellery making and pottery and all this sort of stuff. And then I had to change schools, and I went to a school that they just weren't very good at art, or the art teacher was a bit oppressive. Be like, today everyone has to draw these flowers. And I'd be like, oh, can I do this? And can I do that? And they're like, no. And then I realised that the music block, you could just walk in and the storeroom was open, and you could just go into a room and play a piano or play the drums. And so I found that the music department was where I could play around rather than, and if I ever went into the art department, it was like, no, you can't use the clay. No, you can't touch the wood. No, you can't do that. And so I kind of, when I was quite young, I stopped messing around. I kind of lost interest in artistic stuff in that way, and then just realised music was fun.
Did you learn any instruments at school?
I learned guitar for a bit, but my first instrument was flute.
How did you get into other kinds of music other than ABBA and Blondie?
This girl at school gave me a cassette of London Calling by The Clash. That's when I kind of sort of made the leap from ABBA and Blondie into other stuff.
What was it about London Calling that called you?
First of all, the fact that she had given me the cassette, obviously. And then after that, when you hear things and then you're just like, what is that? You can't work it out, And then there's been a few times in life when you hear something and you just can't work out what it is, and then that was always amazing. When I was like 16 or something, we used to record tracks off John Peel on cassette tape in our lunch breaks and stuff. We would play the cassette tapes of stuff we'd heard on John Peel. It was when grunge was coming in and all that sort of stuff. And there's that band Mudhoney. It was like early Mudhoney releases, and it's just that fuzz guitar, and it just went. Bleh. And I remember really not liking it. And I remember just going home and listening to this Super Fuzz Big Muff record over and over again, forcing myself to enjoy it. Because every time I listened to it, I was just like, but they're singing out of tune, and it's all scrappy and it's messy and it's like, but it was such an alien sound, but it was really thrilling. And then even later, that's how I really got into electronic music as well. Because I remember when I heard like electronic stuff, like I was just like, I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand why the drums were so fast. I didn't understand drum programming or anything, but the sounds of these super high pitched fast drums. And I even had it like years and years later, like in 2005 or something, when I suddenly heard all this like experimental cumbia music coming from Latin America. And again, I was like, what is this? I don't understand it. It has such a weird lopsided rhythm. And I've always just been drawn to things that just confuse me in a good way. But then I really got into music like when I was a bit older, about sort of 17, when I was doing A-levels at the local college. There was a really strong local band scene, and I knew all the older kids, and they all had like punk bands. So I kind of just had that thing where I went to college and then immediately joined a punk band, just immediately started failing everything and completely gave up on academia and just started playing in local bands.
When you were in college, did you know that you were going to do a career in music? Like, was that your aim?
I was convinced that I would be able to work in music. One of my bandmates already worked in music. I knew people whose parents worked in the music. And then I also was meeting bands and knew people who worked in music. So I thought, oh, I'm going to be able to work in music. And though you get the usual thing where your mum's saying to you, no, you've got to have a backup, you've got to have a plan B. And I was always absolutely determined that I would not even consider a backup. But then this whole time, I was constantly working like crappy jobs. Everyone in the band, we all worked in the same pizza restaurant. And then after that, I worked in a shoe packing warehouse for years and years and years and years. I was on a factory line packing shoes. So we did all these really super bad jobs.
And how did you come to London? How did that happen?
I was very fortunate. A friend basically said, you're going to move to London with me. So I actually moved into London proper. And when I moved to London proper, I started making my first album. My housemate at the time was passing demos on my behalf to people because they were much more sociable than I was. I was not able to talk to people in public or anything. The cassette tape got handed to Mike Paradinas at Planet Mu at a gig we were at, and he listened to it, and then about 4 days later he phoned me up and offered me a record deal. What
kind of gear were you using to make the album?
I was using an Atari computer and a sampler with 8 meg of RAM in it, and I had one keyboard. But I had a friend, a drummer, who was doing a lot of it with me on the first album. We had quite a good idea of what we were making, because the idea was just like, he was playing like live drums, I was doing sample drums, I was just chopping up 4 tracks in a sampler, and I had quite a strong idea that I wanted to mash up all this experimental electronic music I was hearing with all the kind of feedback guitar music and some weird location sound recordings that I was enjoying. It's odd to think now, but things were quite polarized at the time. It's like you either played electronic music or you played guitars, and then there was very little mix. Played at Sonar Festival in 2002, and I got up and I played guitar with a laptop, and I think I was probably the only guitar, because it was like an electronic music festival. So so the fact I was just playing guitar and doing like feedback and on beats and then occasionally singing was actually kind of at the time a bit like unique.
Once you had your record deal, what did you work on next?
I was quite affected, and probably still am quite affected by moods and changes of scene and fashions that, so I was picking up on everything. So I kind of started just messing around with different ideas of things, but then I was suddenly tied in with this thing where I was with a proper record label, and there was people and there was publishers and there was managers and all this sort of stuff going on. I was kind of making kind of like 180 degree turns and just suddenly going into a completely different style of music. Then I had that funny thing where people going, yes, we decided that we think you should become more of a performer, and we don't think you perform enough on stage, you need to, can you stop using so much equipment? Can you get someone else to do the equipment? And can you just come to the front and just concentrate on being a front person? And so you start having all this sort of stuff. So I really embraced it. So then I was like, okay, so then I became like very performative. I started dressing up in weird clothes and being more performative. I started sort of trying to do this very sort of like pop kind of thing. And then it completely alienated the audience that I'd built up as a sort of guy behind a bank of equipment. And then I did an album, and it's a bit of a bonkers album, I admit, but it had a lot of really interesting music on it. And I think it kind of pretty much destroyed the entire audience I had. And then after that, I got dropped. My manager dropped me, my label dropped me, the publisher dropped me. I just got left to my own devices, and then I just sort of kept making music, and that's when I got liberated and then just went back to just doing what I do,
Now you're really well known as an engineer and a producer. How did you go about like building studios and learning how to do that?
The good thing is when I got some money for music, I actually spent most of the money on buying gear. I've been working in studios and doing stuff in studios, and I had been helping to demo people and record people. Around the same time as all the deals ended and everything, I also then became homeless. So I then started squatting. So I then got in with a group of friends. We became very kind of like involved in squatting in London. And then I started setting up recording studios in the squats. People would just knew I could record them, so I started helping to record, So I was just doing very sort of basic recording in squat studios.
What do you like about being a producer or being an engineer?
I still really enjoy playing, but I rarely do it. But there's a funny thing where your entire day is spent waiting for the moment of performance. Then the moment when performance happens, and it's an incredibly exciting thrill. And then you have an adrenaline, and then you have a come down from the adrenaline, and then you wake up, and then you start the next day with a kind of long period of waiting. And it's great if you want to read a lot of books and something like that. But eventually the studio became something where I was like, I can actually have nice, long, consistent energy days where, the kind of the consistency of the energy and also just people really enjoy making records, and being in a studio with people is like the best moment you can have with people. Like it's a very particular time. And I think you can really just experience some of the best of people in that way.
Now you're based at the Total Refreshment Centre, sometimes called the TRC, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about how the TRC came into your life.
Alexi sent me a message saying, I found this building. And I said, I've just literally put everything in storage and I've just come out of the studio.
Alexi also goes by Lex, and he started TRC.
And I was like, I can't do another studio now. I need a bit of time off. But a year later, he was still messaging me, and TRC was still available, and still no one had built a studio. So after a year, I was like, okay. But also I needed that year gap to find some extra gear, because I didn't have the right console. So I knew I wanted to build another studio, but I had to find the right stuff, which is quite hard because you need to find the right gear that's going to sound good, and a lot of it's like way too expensive, and the price of stuff vintage has really got too much.
I really like the way the live room sounds here at TRC. Why does it sound like that?
It's lucky it's got just enough different surfaces. The fact it's a concrete floor and we're not on a ground floor is amazing. And it reminds me of like when I first came to TRC, when people would go, where should I put this amp? And I would just walk around the room and I would feel the air pressure in the room. And then suddenly I'd just stand in a spot of the room and I go, I think this instrument should go here. You do it by sensing air pressure, or you can sense the resonance of a space as you walk around it. It has a slightly sloped ceiling, which is thanks to, the former tenants, because it was a rehearsal room before and a studio before that room, and they just did it well, and they put the sloping ceiling, so that's already an amazing start. Just lucked out. And then enough people have played in there, and I think you can feel that. And it has light, it has natural light, which is another thing it's right on that Kingsland Road. That's one of the main thoroughfares heading north out of central London. There's a strong energy generally all around here, and this is Hackney Downs. We forget we're kind of at the top of a down here. So I think, there's a lot of factors that come together, and then also history of the building, and also then the materials in there.
Could you tell me a bit about the history of the building where TRC is?
It was a Caribbean social club for, I think, about good 15 years before we came. And they're still here, but they're now in the warehouse behind us. They're just slightly downsized, but they still have studios behind us, and they still have the social club. But the building housed a carnival troupe, a radio station, lots of local makers and musicians, and social club from the Caribbean scene. Previous to that, the building was built by one of the first mayors of Hackney, and who built his fortune from selling sweets. So the fact that Alexi named it Total Refreshment Centre is just a coincidence, because it's connected to confectionery. I think the petrol station was a car lot, and I think they used to fix up gearboxes in here, but yeah, for the last 11 years it's been a growing community of musicians, and what's nice, at points we've connected over to the previous occupants, a bunch of musicians from the old community that used to do stuff here, and a bunch from the new jazz scene, and we worked on some music.
Some of the artists that you might have heard who've recorded at the Total Refreshment Centre are people like Thurston Moore, Jean Thackery, The Comet is Coming, so a lot of people kind of in the new London jazz scene. That was part 1 of 2 of an interview for Robyn Rocket's Zoom Zoom. Remember that this show comes from a radio show that was on Resonance FM in 2023. You can hear all the shows back again at robynrocket.com/Zoom Zoom. And those shows have the music that the guests are talking about in it. Robyn is spelled Robyn. Or you can find part 2 wherever you get your podcasts from. I'd like to thank the executive producer of this series, Paul Dutnall. Thanks to Arts Council England. Thank you to you for listening. And thank you very much to Kristian for his time.